Welcome, listeners, to another fascinating episode of The Way of Hermes. I'm Jake, and joining me today is my co-host, Emily. We're diving deep into the ancient roots of Hermetic wisdom, specifically exploring the Egyptian influences on the Hermetica.
That's right, Jake. Today, we're unraveling a tapestry of ancient wisdom that's far more intricate than many might realize. The Hermetica, those profound Greek texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, have long been studied for their philosophical and religious insights, but recent scholarship has shed new light on their origins.
Absolutely, Emily. For years, scholars viewed these texts primarily through the lens of Greek philosophy and early Christian thought. But now we're seeing a shift in perspective. Can you tell our listeners about this new understanding?
Certainly, Jake. Recent studies have revealed that many of the concepts found within the Hermetica have deep roots in ancient Egyptian religion and mythology. It's fascinating to see how these ancient Egyptian ideas have shaped what we now know as Hermetic wisdom.
Could you give us an example of how Egyptian mythology influenced the Hermetica?
Of course, Jake. One of the most striking parallels is in the concept of creation through divine speech. In Egyptian mythology, creation was often described as a process involving the formation of a body, the transfer of a divine essence, and the animation of the body through the breath of life.
That sounds remarkably similar to some concepts in the Hermetica. How does this idea manifest in Egyptian mythology?
Well, in Egyptian thought, intellectual powers were personified as deities that enabled creation. Sia, representing perception, Hu, representing authoritative speech, and Heka, representing magic, were crucial in this process. The power of Hu in particular allowed the creator to bring things into being by naming them.
And how does this connect to the Hermetica?
In the Hermetica, we see a similar concept where creation is achieved through the spoken word, called logos. For instance, in the Corpus Hermeticum, it's stated that the creator made the whole cosmos not with hands but by the word. This parallels the Egyptian concept of creation through divine speech.
That's a remarkable connection, Emily. It really highlights how these ancient Egyptian ideas found their way into Hermetic thought. But I'm curious, how did scholars come to recognize these Egyptian influences?
Great question, Jake. Modern scholarship has increasingly recognized the importance of understanding the Hermetica within its Egyptian context. Researchers like Peter Kingsley have pointed out that the Corpus Hermeticum frequently employs Egyptian motifs and theological concepts.
Could you give our listeners an example of these Egyptian motifs in the Hermetica?
Certainly. One clear example is the personification of divine intellect, nous, and the divine word, logos, in the Hermetica. These closely resemble the roles of Sia and Hu in Egyptian tradition. Another interesting connection is the depiction of God as a shepherd, a concept deeply rooted in Egyptian religion, where gods like Re were seen as shepherds of humanity.
That's fascinating, Emily. It seems like there's a lot more Egyptian influence in the Hermetica than many people might realize. But I'm wondering, how did these Egyptian ideas evolve and find their way into Hermetic thought?
The evolution of these ideas is quite intriguing. Jan Assmann, a prominent Egyptologist, traces the development of Egyptian monotheism from the radical exclusivism of Akhenaten to a more inclusive theology that saw all gods as manifestations of a single divine source.
Akhenaten, wasn't he the pharaoh who tried to establish a monotheistic religion in ancient Egypt?
Exactly, Jake. Akhenaten's attempt at monotheism was quite radical for its time. But what's interesting is how this idea evolved over time into what Assmann calls a cosmotheistic perspective. This view sees the world as the embodiment of a soul-like God, and it profoundly influenced Hermetic and Neoplatonic traditions.
So, are you saying that this Egyptian concept of a unified divine principle is reflected in the Hermetica?
Precisely. The Hermetica reflects this monistic theology, presenting a unified divine principle from which all existence emanates. In fact, the Egyptian concept of all oneness, or the one in the millions, appears in Greek texts as the one in the all.
That's a profound connection, Emily. It really shows how these ancient Egyptian ideas were transformed and incorporated into later philosophical and religious traditions. How did this transfer of ideas actually happen?
That's where things get really interesting, Jake. The transfer of these ideas was part of a complex process of cultural exchange and intellectual synthesis, particularly during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. David Klotz, an Egyptologist, emphasizes the complexity of these cross-cultural exchanges in the ancient world. He points out that many concepts found in the Hermetica, Gnostic, and magical texts, which were either written in Egypt or claim Egyptian origins, mirror authentic Egyptian religious ideas.
That's fascinating, Emily. So, are you saying that Egypt was kind of melting pot for these ideas?
In many ways, yes. Egypt, especially during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, was a crucible of intellectual and religious synthesis. Klotz notes that images and concepts from Egyptian texts reappear in various traditions, including apocalyptic, Gnostic, Hermetic, Orphic, and magical texts, as well as in the philosophical works of Plato, Iamblichus, and Plotinus.
Wow, that's quite a range of influences. It really shows how far-reaching these Egyptian ideas were. But how did this synthesis actually occur?
It was a gradual process, Jake. As different cultures interacted in Egypt, particularly in cosmopolitan centers like Alexandria, ideas were exchanged, adapted, and reinterpreted. The Hermetica, for instance, emerged from this rich intellectual environment, blending Egyptian wisdom with Greek philosophical concepts.
I see. So the Hermetica isn't just a Greek interpretation of Egyptian ideas, but rather a new synthesis born from this cultural exchange.
And what's particularly interesting is how these synthesized ideas then spread and influenced other philosophical and religious movements. The concept of a cosmic god or a supreme deity that we find in the Hermetica, for example, became supremely important in late antiquity, influencing Stoicism and related movements.
That's incredible, Emily. It really shows how these ancient Egyptian concepts evolved and found new expression in different contexts. How did this cosmic god idea relate to the earlier Egyptian pantheon?
In Egyptian theology, there was a concept known as all-oneness, or the one in the millions. This idea evolved into the formula, all gods are one, reflecting a cosmotheistic and hypercosmic monotheism that became characteristic of Hellenistic and late antique religiosity.
So in a way, the many gods of Egypt were seen as aspects or manifestations of a single divine principle.
Precisely. And this concept found its way into the Hermetica, which articulates the notion of a single divine source manifesting as multiple gods and entities. It's a beautiful example of how ancient Egyptian theology adapted and found new expression in the Hellenistic world.
This is truly fascinating, Emily. It really highlights the depth and complexity of the Hermetica's Egyptian roots. I think our listeners will be amazed to learn about these connections.
And it's important to note that this recognition of the Hermetica's Egyptian roots doesn't diminish its significance. Rather, it enriches our understanding of these texts, showing how they authentically reflect the wisdom and mystical traditions of ancient Egypt.
Emily, we've covered so much ground already, but I'm curious about how these Egyptian creation myths specifically parallel the concepts in the Hermetica. Can you elaborate on that?
One of the key concepts in Egyptian creation myths is the idea of creation as a process of differentiation. The creator deity was often referred to as the one who made himself into millions. This notion beautifully encapsulates the Egyptian belief that creation was a process where a single original force divided into the diverse elements of the universe without diminishing itself.
That's a profound concept. How does this idea of differentiation manifest in the Hermetica?
Well, in the Hermetica, we see a similar idea of a unified divine principle from which all existence emanates. The Hermetic texts often describe the divine as both transcendent and immanent, pervading all of creation while remaining distinct from it. This mirrors the Egyptian concept of the creator deity manifesting as millions while retaining its essential unity.
I see. And you mentioned earlier about the role of intellectual powers personified as deities in Egyptian mythology. How do these relate to the creative process in Egyptian thought?
In Egyptian mythology, the intellectual powers of Sia, perception, Hu, authoritative speech, and Heka, magic, were crucial in the creative process. These weren't just abstract concepts, but were personified as deities that enabled creation. Hu, in particular, was associated with the power of divine speech in creation.
It reminds me of the concept of the logos in Greek philosophy. Is there a connection there?
The Egyptian concept of creative speech, embodied in Hu, has clear parallels with the Greek notion of logos. In both traditions, the divine word is seen as a creative force. This idea is prominently featured in the Hermetica, where the divine logos is often described as the instrument of creation.
I'm intrigued by this idea of creation through speech. Can you give us an example of how this concept appears in Egyptian mythology?
Certainly. One of the best examples is the god Ptah, who exemplifies the creative mind in Egyptian mythology. According to the Memphite theology, Ptah created the world by conceiving it in his heart, which the Egyptians considered the seat of thought, and bringing it into being through the commands of his tongue.
That's remarkable. It sounds like there's a strong emphasis on the power of thought and speech in creation. How does this compare to other creation myths we might be more familiar with?
Well, Jake, it's interesting you ask that. This concept of creation through divine speech actually predates similar ideas in other traditions. For instance, it bears a striking resemblance to the opening of St. John's Gospel in the Christian tradition.
Wow, that's a powerful connection. It really shows how these ancient Egyptian ideas have had a lasting impact on religious and philosophical thought. How do these creation myths tie into the broader theological framework of ancient Egypt?
These creation myths were part of a complex theological system that sought to explain the nature of the divine and its relationship to the world. The Egyptians had a unique way of reconciling seemingly separate creation myths, such as those of Atum of Heliopolis and Ptah of Memphis, into a coherent worldview.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Hermetic Dialogues, the official podcast of the Way of Hermes website. If you are interested in free articles on Hermeticism and related topics, or want to study this ancient tradition through our online course, be sure to visit our website at wayofhermes.com.